Hi, I'm David Trotter. I'm a leather artist. I work with vegetable tanned cowhide, making leather creations. I create leather artwork and leather accessories, and I've been doing that for my whole life. There's always been a certain amount of curiosity about using leather for artwork, and I've always had to kind of explain to people, that leather is a byproduct of the meat industry, and it is using it to make things out of is a better use than throwing it away, because it used to be basically that it didn't cost anything for the hides, for the leather producers, because it was thought to be a byproduct that wasn't useful. But I haven't seen a whole lot of backlash because of it. I get questioned about it sometimes, but I mean, basically, I just say that, I find that making something beautiful out of something that would otherwise be discarded is not a bad thing to do. It's actually a way of, recycling or reusing something that was not going to be used for anything. The unfortunate thing is the majority of leather, the majority of hides go into leather for things like car seats and furniture and stuff, and that has a limited lifetime, and especially with cars, within 10 or 15 years, it ends up in a landfill. So I think that, once people kind of understand what's going on, that they're not hostile about my using it. They start to, feel a little better about it. And I don't think it really has affected things. It's always been a struggle using leather as an art medium, because it's not something that is common. It's not something that people think about, as using for an art medium. So I have always felt a certain amount that I'm educating people as I am talking to them. I used to do a lot of craft shows and art shows, and would always get a certain amount of questioning of the material that I was using. And I haven't really found that it has been a profound difference in the last few years in terms of being able to sell it. It's always been, since I started working with leather when I was a teenager, it's always been something that was kind of out of the norm. It wasn't something that people had ever seen before or thought much about before. And of course, people use, leather shoes and leather purses, and leather furniture and clothing, of course, have been big in the last 30 or 40 years, probably. And so, no, I haven't seen that myself. I think mostly, I think it depends on what kind of art you're doing with what you're, with the materials that you're using. If it is something that it speaks to people in terms of what you're trying to say, not in terms of what it's made of, then I think that the material doesn't really matter that much. Well, I guess it was just fortunate circumstances. I grew up outside of Toronto, about 30 miles northwest of Toronto, in a very beautiful part of the country. It's very hilly and rocky, a part of the Niagara Escarpment. And we lived on an old farm there that had been used. It was basically a pioneer farm. And there were old log barns on the property, and there was other old barns around on other properties. And there were small farms around that were basically just farms that had cattle and some horses, and usually work horses, and pigs and chickens and stuff. But it was a very rural area. And as a child, I spent most of my time outdoors in the woods and in the fields and poking around old barns. There was a beautiful barn right across the road from us, a hexagonal, actually octagonal barn, 8-sided barn that we used to go into and play around in. So I was very familiar with that kind of thing, but I used to spend a lot of my time making things. I was always picking up stuff that I would find either in the woods or things that were around the farm and making things out of it. And I was always encouraged to do that. So it kind of was a natural thing. Now, my mother had a friend by the name of Daphne who worked with leather, and they lived a couple of kilometers away from us. And she had a little craft shop where she made leather goods, leather jewelry, and decorator items. And my mom used to make some things for her and had leather around our home. So it was always something that was there. And as a kid, I was playing around with it in some of my constructions. And when I was about 16, I started working for Daphne in her shop. So I had a very early start working with leather, and it just kind of carried on from there. I was encouraged by my family as well. My mom had a lot of friends who were artists and craftsmen. And so they encouraged me, and I felt that, you know, this was something that I would like to do, because it was something that was different. It wasn't something that was what normal. It wasn't something that a lot of people were you know, had any ambition to do. But so when I was working at the shop, I was allowed, after I started producing things for her, I started doing some of my own things, and I was encouraged to do that. And she would put them in her shop and sell some of the things that I made there. So it was encouraging for me to see that. And I got feedback from people. I got feedback from customers that would come in, and as my pieces sold, I would get people asking about the process and suggesting things that I could make. And so I started to get orders, and that's just kind of where it went from there. So the process of working with the leather that I use is a cowhide. It's what's known as vegetable tanned cowhide. And because it's vegetable tanned, that means that it can be molded and shaped when it's dampened with water. So one of the first things that you do with it is wet it, and then you can shape it and form it into three-dimensional things, or you can form it into, you know, other shapes that will stay in that shape once the leather dries. So you can create three-dimensional objects like, you know, boxes and dishes, bowls, and things like that. And it works on all different scales. You can take a big piece of leather and mold it into something, or you can take very small pieces and mold them. So you can make details with the leather. It also depends on the thickness. The leather comes in various thicknesses, and you can thin it down or get very thick leather. You can get leather that's, you know, originally they made for the soles of shoes, which is, you know, very thick. Or you can get it as thin as something that would be used in a billfold, or, you know, something like that. So there are a lot of variations in the leather, and you can by gluing it together, or which I call laminating, you can build up the thickness, or put, you know, various layers in one part and leave it thinner at another part. So you can create three-dimensional material doing that. So the process of taking a piece of leather and making something that is colored is quite involved. It's not like taking a piece of paper and putting paint on it, and, you know, when it dries, it's finished. because the leather has this ability to be molded and is usually damp when you start, it takes some time to dry. And when it is in the drying process, at various stages, you can start manipulating it and doing different things with it, like adding texture to the surface by hammering with stamps, or you can take sandpaper and sand the surface. You can do a lot of different things with it, and that's basically what I've done. I do more experimental stuff. I experiment with leather. I experiment with how it works, and that's always what I've done. When I first started out, I spent years trying to figure out how to do things with the leather. One of the early things I figured out how to do was to make it look exactly like weathered board. And that came in very handy because I loved old barns, and I could make the material to make old barns, and I could scale the weathered board down to the size of whatever scale I wanted to for making a wall piece that looked exactly like an old barn. And later on, I learned how to do, make pieces of leather look like iron, rusty iron, all those things. So it's all a matter of experimenting. So I think with any material, a big part of what an artist does is experiment with coloring and texturing and applying different finishes to the material that they're using. And that's exactly what I did. So I look upon what I do more as experimenting with leather rather than producing artwork. What happens in the end usually is artwork, because that's kind of the direction that I want to go with it. But I spend the majority of my time experimenting. And even now, even though I have learned, over a period of 50 years, I guess, I've learned so much in terms of what I can do without even thinking about it, but I'm always kind of pushing that a little bit further and a little bit further to try and see what else I can do with it. So it's never been just a matter of taking a piece of leather and putting some color on it and saying, well, there it is, it's finished. It's always been a matter of working with the material and trying to see how far you can push it and create something beautiful. I was always taught, the lady Daphne, who I worked with, was very big on creativity. And she said, take at least one day a week to experiment, to play around with it and see what you can do with it, and to create something new with it. And I've always done that. I've always felt that was the most important part. And my mission, I had a mission from the time I was, in my early 20s, to see how far I could push the leather in the direction of creating art. And that's, it kind of gives you an idea, but until you see how it can be manipulated. I mean, I use various things to manipulate the leather, various tools I use. Sometimes I heat the leather. I'm in the process right now of using hot water, putting the leather into hot water, and when I pull it out of the hot water, shaping it. And when it dries, after it's been in hot water, it hardens up, so it becomes very rigid and stiff and almost like wood. The trick is to get the right temperature so that you don't overboil it and it curls up and becomes unmanageable and it hardens almost immediately. So it has to be in the right temperature of water so that you can shape it and mold it, and you can continue to do that basically until it dries. And then when it dries, it's fairly hard, and you can create things that you want to be rigid. And so right now I'm actually working on a series of crows and ravens, and I'm doing that by molding the leather that I put in warm water. And the other thing that I've been working with a lot, and this I learned when I was a teenager as well, is that normally dyes are used to color leather. And dyes will color the fiber of the leather and give you a basic color. But the problem with dyes is they tend to disappear after a while. So you need a finish on the surface of the leather. And acrylic paint works very, very well on leather. And that's probably the thing that I do more than anything else, is use acrylic paint. And I don't just put it on the surface of the leather, I rub it into the leather. I use my hands a lot when I'm working and rub thin down acrylic paint into the surface of the leather. And while I'm molding it and so on, the acrylic bends and forms with the leather and doesn't peel off like you would expect. And that has a lot to do with, again, experimentation and coming up with the right consistency of the acrylic. But the acrylic is what gives it the brightness of color, and that goes on the surface, and that gives a very, very durable surface when it adheres to the leather fiber. So when you say, you know, how do you create something with leather? It's a long process from the time that you have a piece of vegetable tan leather that is kind of a flesh color, very soft beigey color, to a three-dimensional finished colored hard product. But you know, I've done so many different things over the years that I kind of know now what I have to do. I don't have to think about it too much anymore, and I can think more about what I'm looking for as an end product, not how I get to that end product. And it has allowed me to do, you know, so many different things. And I've gone through different stages over the years of working with leather to create different things. I spent a lot of time in the fashion industry back in the 1980s, and I was doing jewelry and belts and wearable accessories out of leather. And I used what I had learned from making all the things that I had experimented with when I was younger, and translate that into jewelry and designs for belts and that kind of thing. So it's hard to, there isn't just one thing that you do to create a finished product or a finished piece of artwork in leather. It's a long, slow process to get there. Sometimes it takes me days or even weeks to finish a piece, simply because there are many stages of wetting and drying and heating and all that to get to the point where I feel that it's a finished product. Yeah, I do. Well, you see the weathered gray barn behind me. You know, that is a replica of an actual barn that was just a few kilometers from where I live now. I tend to use what's around me as the inspiration for what I do. And barns have always been one of my favorite things. I used to play in them when I was a kid, and they've always been a real draw for me. And right now in this part of the country, all the old barns that were built back in the 1800s are all starting to fall apart, and a lot of them are disappearing. And I document a lot of them with my camera, take pictures of them. But I also like to make three-dimensional sculptures of them. And of course I use leather because that's what I do. And the barn behind me, the weathered gray barn there, was it was a barn and a couple of sheds that were beautiful. They were gorgeous. They were well maintained, and it was just a very appealing barnyard scene. And so I took pictures and I figured out how big I wanted to make it, and then I started building it. And the barns have a wooden form underneath them because the leather you would have to build a lot of leather up to get the three-dimensional aspect of the pieces. When I'm working on a barn, I do make it three-dimensional, but it's a flattened three-dimensional. It's only about 2 inches deep, and that, and a combination of trying to do it in perspective, makes it look like it's much deeper than it actually is. But that is a reproduction of an actual barn that was within this area. And I've done quite a few local barns, and I get commissions from people to do barns. That particular piece wasn't commissioned, it was one that I wanted to do. But if people have a barn on their property that they want to make into a wall piece that they can take with them when they move, or whether they have to sell the property or whatever, then they have a replica of the barn. And I found that I could make all the different parts for the barn. It was a challenge to make the stone foundation and make the metal parts and make the roof, the shingles on the roof, and the concrete of the silo, or the concrete on the foundation. So over time, I've managed to figure out how to create all those textures on all those surfaces out of leather. So I can take those things and create barns and old houses and that kind of thing. The barn on the other side, the one with the pink background, is a more recent piece. That's one I did just a couple of years ago. And that one I was playing more with the abstract design in the sky. It was a texture. I took a piece of leather and I took it up north onto the smooth rocks up there. And I wet the leather and I pressed it into the rocks, pushing it in with my bare feet. And this is before there's any color in it or anything. And then I bring it back to the studio after it's dried. And I use that as the base for my color. So I start rubbing color into that piece of textured leather. And that's how I created that pink sky behind. And you probably can't see from here, but it has a lot of texture to it. Like it's not smooth. It's got a very bumpy kind of texture to it. And then the barns are in silhouette. They're slightly raised, but they're in silhouette in front of that. So that was a piece that was more of, instead of being an architectural rendition of a particular thing, that was more of a something that I just decided to do in terms of having, you know, the placement of the barns and so on. But it's based on barns that I've done over the years. Oh, the ravens, they are three-dimensional. They are, they're formed. I'm forming them by hand, although I do use some tool or a fixture to pull the leather over to give them some shape. So they're actually three-dimensional. I've made some that are going to be made into like boxes, jewelry boxes, and I'm making some that are going to be incorporated into wall pieces. But I've also made some freestanding ones. The freestanding ones, I've done 3 different sizes of them, one of them being almost life size. And they're made out of 3 or 4 pieces of leather that are molded and shaped. And then they're either stitched or laminated together to give the full size of it. So there's a piece that's used for the wings, and the shoulders of the bird. There's a piece that's used for the back and the top part of the head and the tail, and then there's another piece for the belly and another section for the legs and feet. So they're created out of several pieces, but they're all joined together into one unit at the end. And I started out doing crows. I've always done crows. And I've always added crows into some of my pieces. On some of my barns, I'll have a crow, a small leather crow in there somewhere. Or in one of the larger pieces that has sky in it, I will put a crow flying by. I had pet crows when I was a kid. One of them in particular that was my own pet. I had her for about a year. And so she was just out of the nest. She'd fallen out of the nest, and I, being in the woods at the right time in the right place, picked her up and brought her home and looked after her, and she grew up around. She wasn't in a cage. She was never in a cage. She always was free to come and go, and so she was around. And so I have this affinity for crows. And where I live now, I live in an old barn, and that's where my studio is, and that's where my living quarters are. And there are a lot of crows and ravens around here, and I've sort of befriended them, and they come around and hang around in the trees around here, and I make noises that some people might think are a little rude, but the crows and ravens seem to be quite interested. And so I've always had this thing about them. So I do have some crows and ravens hanging in my studio, and various sculptures around that are crows and ravens. And part of the reason I find that people really like them, or they're very drawn to them. And I have this thing about them. So it was a natural thing to just start doing it. I find that a lot of the things I do are things that I have an interest in. And then I find that the people that come to my studio are interested in that and make comments on it. And that encourages me. And I've always found that I get good feedback from people, and that kind of encourages me to keep going in that direction. So some of the things that I do, I've been doing ever since I started working the same designs, basic designs, although they, each one is different, each one changes, but it's the same things that I've been doing since I was, 17 or 18 years old when I first started, in terms of, the basic shapes and what they're for. I was just going to say that basically, as I consider myself a leather artist now, but I had a hard time with that term. Leather is not considered necessarily to be an artistic medium, and so I used to call myself a leather craftsman back when I was making more craft type things. I made a lot of jewelry boxes and jewelry. I made a lot of jewelry and that kind of stuff. Leather belts. I've made a lot of leather belts, and they are always one of a kind. I always make them like each one is a piece of artwork. But I always felt that I was a craftsman, and I always felt that there was kind of a little bit of a hostility towards craftsmen that called themselves artists from the artistic community. There's always been this division between craft and art, and what is craft and what is art, and where do the two meet. And so I've always felt that initially I was a leather worker, because when I started, I was tracing out things for Daphne. I would trace out on damp leather, trace out the patterns that she had for bracelets or for earrings or for whatever. And gradually I learned how to do the coloring, and gradually I learned a little bit more about it. So initially I was like a leather worker. And then after I'd spent several years doing that and doing a lot of experimenting and so on, I found that I was becoming more of a craftsman. I was more professional in the way I approached it. I finished things more completely. I had a much better idea of how the material worked. So I would make pieces that were very, very complete and very well finished all the way around. So I called myself a leather craftsman. For a while, I had to take a full-time job, and I was very fortunate in that I found a job working in leather. There was a company that was advertising for a leather designer / craftsman to supervise production of leather tool pouches. It was a company that sold tools and equipment for the electrical trade. So I spent 27 years working as basically an industrial designer, working with industrial machinery, working with leather, and supervising production of leather tool pouches, and also purchasing the leather. So I purchased leather from tanneries all over the world to make these leather tool pouches from. And in the process, I learned how to use leather in a different way and how to design it purely for function, how to use heavy leathers and put them together using machinery like rivet machines and sewing machines, and splitting leather down to a different weight to make it work for pockets and stuff. And so when I was doing all that, I made briefcases and I made all that kind of stuff that would be considered more, of the luggage trade. Um, and it was a very crucial part of what I am now, because I have some machinery that I use in my work now that I wouldn't have even known about had I not gone into that industrial end of it for a while. So after 27 years of doing that, and collecting a lot of leather samples along the way, I started full time back into doing my leather artwork. I had never given that up. I'd always done that in my spare time, and I made some of the most elaborate pieces I've done so far during that time, because once I was home from work, I could focus on my work in my studio. And I made some very large barns and buildings that took me, months to complete, which I don't have the luxury of doing at the moment. Um, because I am trying to produce, enough to survive on, and also to be able to keep doing it. I have to sell a certain amount of it to be able to keep doing it. So when I find something like the ravens and the crows that people relate to and that I like doing, it works out. It works out well, because I can continue my exploration of the leather, and still I have something that people are interested in and that I can sell. I started out when I was in I went to college and took an art course at college, so I get my art fundamentals. So I knew what art was, and what good design was, and I learned all the different things about working with colors and so on. And after that, I started doing local craft shows. I started taking my work to shows. And I continued to do that for quite a long time. I ended up doing large art and craft shows in Canada, in the Toronto area, and also in the northeastern United States. I did a lot of shows in New York, in Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, and places like that. Eventually moving to northern New York for a couple of years. But that's been how I sold my work for the most part, was at craft fairs and craft shows. I have shown in galleries. Unfortunately, initially when I tried to get into galleries, I ran into that problem of art and craft. And a lot of times I wouldn't be able to get into galleries, because this is before the art and craft kind of merged at that point, where there is a lot of craft now that is in galleries that are art galleries. But back, this would have been in the late 70s, early 80s, it was difficult. It was difficult unless you were working in one of the craft fields, like glass or metal, or metal was kind of a shoe-in, because metal sculpture was always something that was considered art, although maybe there was a point that it wasn't. So, it took a long time for woodworkers and people working in clay and stuff to be accepted in art galleries that were selling strictly art. So leather was kind of a late comer to that market. I found that I applied to a lot of galleries and they were not interested, because I was considered to be a leather worker, and leather wasn't something that they were interested in. So it took a long time to get to the point where I could sell in galleries. And so in the meantime, I went to a lot of high-end craft shows that were basically, selling art. Some of the big shows in the States that were put on by American Craft Enterprises and so on were basically art shows, or, and there was a lot of fashion related stuff there too. They had a fashion offshoots. So I've always related directly to the public with my work, and I find that is the way I like to do it. I like to be able to see what people think about it, and get people's ideas, and get the feedback, because I tend to get ideas from the feedback. And I found that craft and craft art shows were the best way to do that. And I still have customers that I met at art and craft shows 30 or 40 years ago. So I do also sell through a few high-end craft shops or high-end craft art shops. And that's basically it. I also sell through my studio. I've been working really hard to get my studio known so people will consider that a destination when they come out in the country. I'm still only an hour from downtown Toronto, but I live out in the country. And I've been in this location with my shop open here for probably 10 or 12 years now. And I'm starting to build a clientele that seek me out when they're going for a drive in the country or whatever. So I like that personal touch. I like being able to relate to the people that are buying my work, and it pleases me when they when they buy a piece and take it home and have it hanging in their living room, and I get pictures sent from people that show my artwork and they're hanging in their living room, that kind of thing. So I haven't yet done a lot of shows, one-man shows or group shows. I've been into a few local galleries with my work for group shows, but I have yet to do a large one-man show in a gallery at this point. I'm quite optimistic. I'm quite optimistic about the future of leather design. I'm finding for a long time, I felt that it was, as a lot of people seem to feel, that it's kind of a dying art. But there's a few of us out there who are doing, more experimental and more artistic work with leather. And we are few and far between. It's not something, it's not as common as some of the other crafts. But I am optimistic because I'm finding a lot more interest amongst the younger people. I'm finding that there's a group of people in their 20s and 30s who are looking at it a little bit differently than their older brothers and sisters or parents looked at it. And I'm really surprised when I go to one of the shops where I pick up some of my supplies. It's a leather shop that carries all the standard supplies and materials for leather craftsmen. And there are a lot of younger people there buying supplies for doing leather work. And that really, I'm very happy about that. I also find that there's quite a bit of interest when I teach classes at a shop not too far from here. And I find there are a lot of people that are actually interested in what I'm doing and want to come and see how it's done. So I don't think it's as it's quite as what shall I say, depressing thinking about where it's all going, as you might think. Now, of course, if we stop eating beef and there's no leather around, I guess we'll end up working with a new form of material that imitates leather, because there seems to be a lot of that coming along now. In fact, there are products that I want to try out. There are leathers being made out of fungus, and there are leathers being made out of cactus in Mexico. So they're not actually leather, but they are a leather-like material. Of course, there's plastic leather, which leather workers tend to look down on and call it pleather. But it has its place too, and I have used it a little bit, not a whole lot because I like the real thing. But so I'm interested in trying out some of these other materials that imitate leather, because basically I'm imitating other materials with the leather. I imitate wood and I imitate metal and I imitate plastic with my leather. So I want to try it the other way around. I did try some paper leather a few years ago that was kind of interesting. It was kind of like cardboard, but it certainly has a place there too. So it's not just the fact that it's leather, it's that it is a flat, pliable material that you have to manipulate to use for three-dimensional things and to add color to. So I think that as long as there's leather around, there's going to be people that are going to be doing things with it. And I found online, I found quite a few people. There seems to be a lot of interest in Japan and in China in working with leather. And there's some just amazing work being done there. I see some things online that are just incredible. So I think there's a good future for it. But yeah, there'll always be some resistance to it, I suppose. Yeah, there are some hazards. There are hazards of working with some leathers. There are different kinds of leather that there are dangerous chemicals used in the process of making the leathers. And so it's not something that you want to be handling a lot. But the kind of leather that I use and that most people who are working with leather with their hands is what's called a vegetable tanned leather. And basically it means that the hides are soaked in a tree bark, sorry, soaked in a tea made of tree bark. Certain kinds of tree barks have more tannin in it than others. So there's certain tree barks that are used to tan the hides in. The hides are soaked in a tea made of this tannin or tree bark. And that is basically how the leather is made. That is what keeps the leather from going bad or from rotting and makes it so that it will last for 100 years or longer. And so the leather that I work with is not particularly toxic. I don't know that it is toxic at all. It's biodegradable. You can compost it if you want. So it basically has, you know, the tannin from the tree bark. And I suppose the tannins are not good for your hands, but there's no fumes or anything from it. And I generally use gloves if I'm handling it a lot. But for years I didn't use gloves, and I don't think that it's affected me at all. So there really is nothing in terms of fumes from it or in the leather if it is a vegetable tanned leather. Now, that said, vegetable tanned leather is not something that is produced in the quantities that leather that's used for upholstery or used for clothing is made in. That's made in huge quantities, and it has carcinogenic chemicals that are used in the process, and it's very environmentally damaging, that tanning process. So there's these two streams, there's probably more than that, but two major streams of leather production, making the actual leather from the hides. And that is one that's called chrome tanned, and that has chromium dioxide and other things in it that are very dangerous. And so what's happened is a lot of the production of that kind of leather has been pushed off to third world countries where their environmental standards aren't so high. And it makes it so that, you know, that leather is not produced in North America or in Europe very much anymore. And the vegetable tan leather used to be used a lot for saddlery and for shoes and that kind of thing. It's not so much anymore. So the production of vegetable tan leather has gone down quite a bit. There isn't as much of it. Now, there's still a lot of tanneries producing vegetable tan leather. I get a lot of leather from South America. There are a lot of vegetable tanneries there. And it's not to say that that process isn't a little bit environmentally not good as well, but there are ways, because there's a lot of water used in the process, but there are ways of cleaning the water, and a lot of the newer tanneries have processes for cleaning the water and, you know, reusing it in the process, so it's not polluting. So I don't think that there's anything dangerous about working with vegetable tanned leathers, and there's certainly the process as all the manufacturing of it becomes more up to date. It can be made. There's a couple of tanneries in the United States that make vegetable tan leather, who are under the environmental standards that apply in the states that they're in, and the same in Canada. There's still tanneries that are making vegetable tan leather because they're able to do it in an environmentally sound way. I think that we need to be doing that, not just with the leather trades, but with a lot of the trades that that involve working with your hands and using your knowledge to make things, create things, and fix things, and that kind of thing. I don't have anyone working with me at the moment in an apprenticeship type program. I would like to have an apprentice to be able to teach some of the things that I do, and to carry on with this trade. It's something that we've lost a lot of the information and a lot of the knowledge that has been around for hundreds of years, simply because we don't do this stuff very much anymore. And it's something that I do want to do. I did have a couple of apprentices many years ago, and a couple of them have gone on. One in particular has gone on to be a leather craftsperson, and she does quite amazing stuff. I still am in touch with her, and she's not too far from where I live here. But I would like to do that again. Unfortunately, it involves having to get government involvement to try and find people who are interested in it, and to help to pay for the apprenticeship. But definitely it's something I think is important. And I would like to think that, that someone is able to carry on with some of the things that I've done. I do have some hope, though. I have 3 grandchildren who seem to be quite interested in doing leather work, and I keep all my little scrap pieces in boxes for them, and when they come to visit, we get out the boxes of leather scraps, and they're very happy to start tooling and coloring and gluing and putting pieces of things together. And I have all these little creations around my studio that were made by my grandchildren. So I'm hoping that one of them will take enough interest that they might carry on the trade. I found actually the lady that does leatherwork that I trained when she was in college, she just told me recently that her youngest son has taken this up, and he's actually going professional as a leather worker. And I have yet to see his website, but he's making leather goods that he learned from her, that she learned from me. So that's kind of exciting too. And yes, I think that it's very important that the government get more involved in putting together programs where senior artists who have years of experience and knowledge from generations past, to be able to carry that on. We've lost so much. I think it's really important, especially in this time when people are getting farther and farther away from working with their hands, and working only with their brain and their eyes in front of a screen. I think it's important, and I think I find that when I'm teaching the classes that I teach now, I'm getting a lot of people coming that just want to make something, want to feel like they're creating something, want to feel, that the ideas that they're getting, they can translate into a physical product that they can take home and look at it and think about it. I think that we're not getting that very much anymore. It's not something that is common for people to do. And I think that goes back again to what we were talking about, whether there's interest in this or not, and whether the people are willing to buy leather artwork. I think people do want to have beautiful things in their homes that are made by hand, that show that there are, is thought and expertise going into making things that you can look at and admire and have, to that it's not made by a machine or made in a factory somewhere. It's something that someone has thought about, and someone has used what's in their mind to make something that you can actually feel and lift and hold and examine and think about. I think that that's very important, and I think that is something that is starting to come back again. There was a time back in the 70s and early 80s when crafts seemed to be a very big thing, and there was a lot of interest, and it started to wane through the 80s and 90s and into the early 2000s. And I'm hoping and thinking that I'm seeing it starting to come back, that people are looking for something more than just sitting in front of a screen and absorbing all this information. They want to do something. They want to put their effort into making something with these tools that we have here, and do something that makes them feel good. It makes you feel good to take your hands and take a raw material and convert that raw material into something beautiful or something interesting, at least.